stop. He just kept going. And when he landed, he was just ecstatic. He was the sort of person who got to the end of a roof and kept going. That sense that with the right team behind him, he could do anything served him well for the rest of his life.
Inside these walls,
freedom come, freedom come.
Noyce didn't remain a believer, but he always held on to the values of his Congregationalist upbringing. Grinnell's 19th century pioneers had left the conservative East Coast for the American frontier to set up a free-thinking, nonconformist community.
Our congregations are independent. That is to say, we are part of a denominational structure, but the denomination or the national church has no authority whatsoever over the individual congregations. So this sense of individualism, responsibility for your own decisions and your own future is very much part of the tradition, and I think that was part of Bob's upbringing and exceedingly influential with him.
Grinnell was exceptional for a small town in having a highly respected college, a legacy of its founding fathers. After graduating top of his year in high school, Noyce enrolled at Grinnell College and embraced campus life to the full.
The interesting thing about Noyce is he doesn't fit the stereotype of your classic high-tech nerd. He was very into swimming. He swam his entire life, so he was always in great shape. He didn't look like a nerd. He looked like a jock. And with that deep voice of his and his outgoing manner and his natural leadership, I suspect he ruled that campus.
But for all his other activities, Noyce never lost his academic focus. He found a kindred spirit in the college's physics professor, Grant Gale.
Well, my sense is they were two of a kind. Bob Noyce was a tinkerer, Grant Gale was a tinkerer. They both liked to figure out how things worked. They didn't necessarily like to just read about it.
Under Gale's tuition, Noyce explored the principles behind the technology of the day, particularly how the flow of electricity could be amplified to power and control radio or telephone devices.
The idea is to produce a valve, something like this. What's a valve? Well, what a valve does is controls the flow of water. If I were able to figure out a way of controlling this valve by a very weak flow of water, I could then go ahead and get a larger response in the amount of water flowing out here. That would be an amplifier. That's what I want to build, except I want to build it for electricity. Now, a way was developed for doing this early in the 20th century. That's basically the electron vacuum tube. The disadvantages are, well, they use a fair amount of power because of the heater. They're a little bit big for a lot of applications that one might have in mind. And the other is that there's simply the cost of construction of this thing.
But Noyce was about to get an early look at a brand new invention that would render the electron tube extinct. It was called the transistor.
Here at last was a device so tiny that several would fit inside a thimble. They can do the same job as electron tubes and require only a fraction of the power tubes used to operate.
Invented in 1947 by John Bardeen, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley, the transistor used a solid material called a semiconductor to act as an amplifier, or switch. Through personal connections, Grant Gale got hold of technical reports about the device at an early stage and shared them with Noyce.
This enlarged diagram shows that a transistor is a sandwich made of 3 layers of a semiconducting metal. The first layer is the emitter. The middle layer is the base, and the third layer is the collector. The emitter is a reservoir of electrons. There is a barrier, like a dam, in the base. The height of this dam may be raised and lowered by a very small amount of electric current, thus regulating the flow of electrons from the emitter to the collector.
The final transistors look like this. The advantages are, well, they don't take an awful lot of power. The size is nice. Smaller, a lot smaller than the electron tube. And these are a lot cheaper to make than to make something like this.
The story of Noyce is like the story of Silicon Valley, in the sense that luck has an enormous part to play in all of this, being in the right place at the right time. This amazing coincidence that you have this guy with a natural aptitude for it, taking a class from one of the few professors in the country, especially in the heartland, who's interested in transistors. 1,000,000 to 1 shot. And that's how we get Bob Noyce.
7 years after he graduated from Grinnell College, Noyce, like his Congregationalist forebears, headed west to the new frontier. In February 1956, he flew to California for the most important job interview of his life. Now 28, Noyce was accompanied by his wife, Betty, whom he'd met while studying for his PhD.
What drew them to each other? These things are always a big mystery. My mother was a very witty, clever person. I think my father appreciated that. And he always had this charismatic quality that he never had any trouble finding girlfriends.
The Noyces had been living in Philadelphia, where Bob worked in the transistor department of the electronics company, Philco. But he'd now been invited to apply for a job with William Shockley, the co-inventor of the transistor, who was recruiting the brightest young talents in the industry. Never lacking in confidence, Noyce found a new house before he did the interview.
Well, my wife was not going to move to the West Coast unless she was living in a house instead of an apartment. I wanted very much to go to work for Bill Shockley.
So you did it.
And I was pretty confident I'd get a job offer.
Noyce got the job, but his wife's demand for a housing upgrade was understandable. Shockley had chosen to locate his new company in the mainly farming area south of San Francisco. This was in order to be near Stanford University and his elderly mother. Otherwise, the future Silicon Valley seemed like the back of beyond.
I came from a very large company back east, and so that was a big leap of faith to begin with. And then when I got out here and I saw the rather primitive nature of things, it was a bit of a shock, but a challenge at the same time.
Shockley planned to build a silicon transistor, which would be cheaper and more reliable than the industry standard germanium. His previous experience made Noyce a key figure in the development effort.
He started out 6 or 7 jumps ahead of everybody else, and everybody grew, but he always had more of a background, and he was a very bright guy. And